The global economy just crossed a dangerous new line. In 2025, Washington has unleashed a wave of tariffs so aggressive that markets, manufacturers, and governments around the world are scrambling to react. This is not a routine trade dispute or a political headline designed for domestic applause. It is the opening salvo of a full-scale trade war, one that threatens to fracture supply chains built over decades and redraw the rules of global commerce. Factories are already feeling the strain, prices are beginning to shift, and allies are quietly questioning what comes next. Is this a calculated strategy to restore American industrial power, or the spark that ignites a far wider economic crisis? What unfolds from here will shape jobs, inflation, and geopolitical power long after the headlines fade. The shock did not come with a gradual build-up or a careful diplomatic rollout. It arrived abruptly in the form of signed orders and tariff schedules that sent tremors through financial markets and boardrooms worldwide. In 2025, the United States did not merely adjust its trade policy, it detonated it. What unfolded was the most aggressive tariff wave in modern American history, one that immediately reframed global economic expectations and forced every major trading partner to reassess its exposure to the world's largest consumer market. At the center of this decision was a sweeping set of tariffs imposed under the Trump administration, calibrated not for symbolism but for maximum impact. Imports from China were hit hardest, with duties reaching as high as 60% on a broad range of goods. This was not limited to niche products or politically convenient targets. Electronics, machinery, consumer devices, and critical industrial inputs all fell under the new regime. For companies that had spent decades integrating Chinese manufacturing into their supply chains, the cost shock was immediate and severe. But China was only the beginning. In a move that stunned even close allies, the United States imposed 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, its partners in North America's tightly interwoven production network. These tariffs struck at the heart of industries that rely on cross-border movement of components, particularly automobiles, auto parts, and heavy manufacturing. Vehicles assembled in the United States often contain parts that cross borders multiple times before final assembly. By taxing each crossing, the new tariffs effectively multiplied costs throughout the system. Europe was not spared. Heavy levies were placed on European exports, targeting steel, automobiles, machinery, and pharmaceuticals. These measures cut directly into sectors that underpin Europe's industrial strength and export-driven economies. For countries like Germany, where manufacturing forms a core pillar of economic stability, the tariffs represented not just a commercial dispute but a structural threat. Perhaps most consequential was the introduction of a universal tariff, ranging from 10 to 20%, applied to most developing countries. This marked a decisive break from decades of U.S. trade policy that differentiated between strategic rivals, allies, and emerging economies. By flattening those distinctions, Washington signaled that access to the American market would now come at a higher price for almost everyone. For developing nations dependent on exports to fuel growth, the implications were immediate. Shrinking margins, reduced competitiveness, and heightened vulnerability to economic shocks. What made this tariff wave especially destabilizing was its focus on critical sectors rather than discretionary goods. Electronics underpin everything from consumer markets to military systems. Automobiles sit at the intersection of manufacturing, employment, and technological innovation. Steel is foundational to infrastructure and defense. Pharmaceuticals are essential to public health and national security. By targeting these sectors simultaneously, the tariff struck at the core of the global industrial system. The rationale offered by the administration was straightforward: protect American industry, reduce trade deficits, and force companies to bring production back home. Yet the mechanics of global trade make such outcomes far from automatic. Modern supply chains are not easily relocated. They are the product of decades of investment, specialization, and logistical optimization. When tariffs rise suddenly, companies cannot simply flip a switch and rebuild factories overnight. Instead, they face a painful interim period marked by higher costs, disrupted production, and strategic uncertainty. The immediate result was chaos. Shipping contracts were renegotiated or canceled. Orders were delayed as firms tried to determine who would absorb the added costs. Some manufacturers passed prices on to consumers, fueling inflationary pressure. Others absorbed losses, eroding profitability and investment capacity. Smaller firms, lacking the financial cushion of multinational giants, found themselves particularly exposed. Markets reacted swiftly. Volatility spiked as investors tried to price in the long-term consequences of a fragmented trade environment. Currencies adjusted as countries anticipated shifts in export demand. Governments convened emergency meetings to assess retaliation options and support measures for affected industries. What had once been a relatively predictable global trading system suddenly looked fragile. Crucially, this was not just about economics. Trade policy is a tool of power, and the 2025 tariff wave was a declaration that the United States was willing to wield that tool aggressively, even at the cost of straining alliances. By targeting allies and rivals alike, Washington signaled that it viewed economic interdependence less as a shared benefit and more as a source of leverage. This approach carries profound implications. Tariffs of this scale invite retaliation not only in kind but through alternative channels such as regulatory barriers, subsidies, and strategic decoupling. Countries affected by the tariffs began accelerating efforts to diversify markets, strengthen regional trade agreements, and reduce dependence on the U.S. economy. Over time, such adjustments can erode the very leverage tariffs are meant to create. There is also a deeper structural question at play. The global trade system that emerged after World War II was built on the premise of gradual liberalization, dispute resolution through institutions, and predictable rules. The 2025 tariff wave represents a sharp departure from that model. It replaces multilateral negotiation with unilateral pressure and long-term planning with abrupt shocks. For American consumers and workers, the outcomes are mixed and uncertain. While some domestic producers may benefit from reduced competition, many others depend on imported inputs to remain competitive. Higher input costs can lead to layoffs, delayed investment, and higher prices at the checkout counter. The promise of reshoring jobs competes with the reality of automation, capital intensity, and the time required to rebuild industrial ecosystems. As the dust begins to settle, one thing is already clear: this is not a temporary skirmish. The scale and breadth of the 2025 tariffs mark the opening phase of a prolonged trade confrontation with global consequences. The decisions made in Washington have set off a chain reaction that will reshape supply chains, alliances, and economic strategies for years to come. What began as a policy announcement has become a defining moment, forcing the world to confront a new era of economic conflict where stability is no longer assumed, and every link in the global system is being tested. At first glance, tariffs look like numbers on a spreadsheet, percentages attached to import codes that feel distant from everyday life. But behind those numbers sits a fragile, highly engineered system that took decades to build. When those tariffs surged in 2025, they did not simply raise prices. They began to tear at the invisible architecture of global supply chains, an architecture so complex that even small disruptions can ripple outward with astonishing force. To understand the scale of the damage, consider how modern manufacturing actually works. Very few products are made in a single country from start to finish. Instead, they are assembled through global networks where components cross borders multiple times before becoming a finished good. This system exists not because corporations enjoy complexity, but because efficiency demanded it. Specialized regions emerged for chips, batteries, precision tooling, software integration, and final assembly. Over time, China became the central node in this network, not just as a low-cost producer, but as a highly capable manufacturing ecosystem. Take the smartphone in your pocket. More than 90% of the components inside an iPhone are sourced from China or produced within Chinese industrial clusters. This includes not only assembly, but screens, circuit boards, connectors, sensors, and countless subcomponents that require tightly synchronized logistics. When the United States imposed tariffs of up to 60% on Chinese imports, it placed companies like Apple in an impossible position almost overnight. There are only two theoretical responses to such a shock. The first is to absorb the tariffs by raising prices. The second is to move production elsewhere. Both options carry severe consequences. Raising prices risks weakening demand in a highly competitive market. Smartphones are no longer luxury goods. They are mature products with thin margins and intense global competition. A sudden 30 or 40% increase in retail prices would not be absorbed quietly by consumers. It would alter buying behavior, slow upgrade cycles, and pressure sales volumes across the industry. The alternative: shifting prod. Action sounds appealing in political speeches but collapses under scrutiny. Relocating manufacturing at this scale is not a matter of signing a new contract. It requires building factories, training tens of thousands of workers, establishing supplier networks, securing reliable power, water, and transportation infrastructure, and integrating quality control systems that meet exacting standards. Countries like India and Vietnam are often mentioned as replacements, and while they are expanding rapidly, they do not yet possess the depth, density, or speed of China's manufacturing base. Even when production does move, it rarely moves cleanly. Companies often end up fragmenting their supply chains with components sourced from multiple countries to mitigate tariff exposure. This increases complexity, raises logistics costs, and introduces new vulnerabilities. Delays become more common, inventory buffers grow, efficiency falls. What was once a finely tuned system becomes heavier, slower, and more expensive. The consequences extend far beyond consumer electronics. The automotive industry offers an even clearer illustration of how destructive these tariffs can be. Modern cars are among the most globally integrated products ever made. A single vehicle can contain parts from dozens of countries, assembled through just-in-time delivery systems that leave little room for disruption. German and Japanese automakers rely heavily on exporting finished vehicles and components to the United States, while also operating assembly plants inside North America that depend on imported parts. When tariffs hit European and Asian auto exports, the cost shock travels straight to the showroom. German and Japanese vehicles become significantly more expensive for American buyers, not because of corporate greed but because the underlying economics have changed. Manufacturers must either accept lower margins or pass costs on to consumers. In most cases, it becomes a mix of both, squeezing profitability while still driving prices higher. This has secondary effects that are often overlooked. As prices rise, demand shifts. Consumers delay purchases or move downmarket. Dealerships see slower turnover. Suppliers face reduced orders. Workers across the value chain, from factory floors to logistics hubs, feel the pressure. What began as a trade policy decision translates into real economic stress across multiple layers of society. Electronics beyond smartphones face similar dynamics. Televisions, laptops, networking equipment, and industrial electronics are deeply tied to Chinese supply chains. Tariffs of this magnitude do not just add a tax, they force companies to redesign products, renegotiate contracts, and rethink entire sourcing strategies. Each adjustment adds friction, and friction in global trade is the enemy of growth. There is also a strategic dimension to this disruption. Supply chains are not just economic tools, they are instruments of power. For decades, the United States benefited from a system in which it sat at the center of global consumption while production was distributed according to efficiency. By destabilizing that system, Washington may gain short-term leverage, but it also incentivizes other countries to reduce their exposure to U.S. policy risk. As companies and governments adapt, they begin to invest in alternative trade routes, regional manufacturing hubs, and new financial arrangements. Over time, this can lead to a more fragmented global economy, one in which efficiency is sacrificed for resilience and political alignment. Such a world is not necessarily safer or more prosperous. It is often more expensive, more volatile, and more prone to conflict. The irony is that supply chains do not collapse all at once. They degrade slowly through higher costs, longer lead times, and accumulated inefficiencies. Consumers notice it when prices creep upward. Companies feel it when margins shrink. Governments confront it when growth slows and inflation rises. By the time the damage is fully visible, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. In the short term, the 2025 tariffs create shock and uncertainty. In the long term, they threaten to permanently alter how goods are made and moved around the world. The destruction of supply chains is not a dramatic explosion. It is a grinding process that erodes trust, coordination, and efficiency. And once that erosion sets in, rebuilding what was lost can take a generation. As factories reconsider where to invest, as engineers rethink how to design products around fragmented sourcing, and as consumers adjust to a more expensive reality, one question hangs over the global economy. Is this disruption a necessary correction to an imbalanced system, or the beginning of a prolonged period of economic self-inflicted damage? The answer will not emerge in headlines or quarterly reports. It will reveal itself slowly in the altered shape of global trade itself. The moment the tariffs were announced, the world did not wait to see how bad the damage might become. It reacted instantly and in many cases instinctively. Global trade is not governed by patience or goodwill, it is governed by leverage. When the United States moved to redraw the rules in 2025, other powers responded not with speeches but with countermeasures designed to protect their own economic and strategic interests. China's response was swift and calculated. Beijing did not lash out blindly. Instead, it targeted pressure points it knew Washington would feel. Higher tariffs were imposed on American soybeans, a move aimed squarely at the U.S. agricultural heartland. For years, American farmers had relied on China as a massive, dependable buyer. That dependency became a vulnerability. As Chinese buyers shifted to Brazil and other suppliers, U.S. exports faced oversupply, falling prices, and renewed political pressure at home. The message from Beijing was unmistakable. Trade wars are not fought on spreadsheets, they are fought in real economies with real constituencies absorbing the pain. Aircraft were another carefully chosen target. The aerospace industry represents not only high-value manufacturing but national prestige and technological leadership. By raising barriers on American planes, China signaled its willingness to accelerate its own domestic aviation ambitions while squeezing one of America's most globally competitive sectors. This was not retaliation for its own sake. It was a strategic recalibration, using the trade conflict to advance long-term industrial goals that had been in motion for years. Europe's reaction followed a different rhythm but moved in the same direction. Brussels framed its response in legal and procedural language, but the substance was unmistakably political. European leaders began preparing counter-tariffs, focusing on symbolic and economically sensitive American exports. The aim was not escalation for escalation's sake but deterrence. Europe understood that if it appeared passive, it risked being sidelined in a world where trade power increasingly flowed to those willing to act decisively. At the same time, the European Union faced an internal dilemma. Many European economies are deeply integrated into global supply chains that pass through both China and the United States. Retaliating too aggressively risked collateral damage at home, yet failing to respond risked signaling weakness. The result was a careful balancing act, one that exposed the limits of multilateral coordination in an era of unilateral economic force. Beyond the major powers, the trade shock rippled outward to countries that were never the intended targets but could not escape the consequences. India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and parts of Southeast Asia suddenly found themselves at the center of a global recalculation. Multinational companies accelerated what had already been a cautious trend, the so-called China Plus One strategy. The logic was simple. Reduce exposure to Chinese manufacturing by diversifying production into alternative locations. On paper, this looked like an opportunity. Investment announcements surged. Governments promoted themselves as the next manufacturing hubs, but the reality proved more complex. China's dominance was not built solely on cheap labor. It rested on infrastructure, logistics, supplier density, and a skilled workforce refined over decades. Replicating that ecosystem is not a matter of tax incentives or political goodwill. It requires time, capital, and institutional capacity that many emerging economies are still struggling to develop. Factories can be built quickly. Entire industrial ecosystems cannot. Power grids, ports, highways, customs efficiency, labor training, and regulatory consistency all matter. As companies tested alternative locations, they encountered bottlenecks that slowed production and raised costs. In some cases, firms found themselves dependent on Chinese inputs even when final assembly moved elsewhere, blunting the very diversification they sought. For developing nations outside these emerging hubs, the outlook was even more troubling. Many rely heavily on global demand for basic manufactured goods, textiles, raw materials, and intermediate products. A global trade war does not simply reshuffle supply chains, it suppresses demand. As uncertainty rises, companies delay orders, consumers pull back, and growth projections are revised downward. For countries already operating on thin margins, this indirect shock can be devastating. Textile exporters, for example, may not be directly targeted by tariffs, but they feel the slowdown when retailers in the United States and Europe cut back on inventory. Commodity producers experience price volatility as industrial demand fluctuates. Currencies weaken, debt servicing becomes harder. What began as a dispute between major powers quietly becomes a systemic risk for the global South. There is also a deeper psychological shift in place. For decades, the assumption underpinning globalization was that trade disputes would be managed, contained, and ultimately resolved within a rules-based framework. The events of 2025 challenged that assumption. Governments and corporations alike began to price in political risk as a permanent feature of global commerce. That shift alone changes behavior in profound ways. When uncertainty becomes structural, investment becomes cautious. Long-term planning gives way to defensive strategies. Companies prioritize resilience over efficiency even if it means higher costs. Governments pursue self-sufficiency in critical sectors even if it fragments markets. The world does not deglobalize overnight, but it does become less interconnected, less predictable, and less forgiving. Perhaps most striking is how quickly alliances begin to shift under this pressure. Trade partnerships once taken for granted are reconsidered. New regional blocs gain momentum. Countries that can position themselves as neutral, reliable manufacturing bases find leverage they did not previously possess. Others find themselves squeezed between competing economic giants, forced to choose sides or risk exclusion. In this environment, every reaction feeds the next. China's retaliation encourages diversification. Diversification strains emerging markets. Strained markets reduce global demand. Reduced demand feeds political instability, which in turn justifies further protectionism. The The cycle is not inevitable, but once in motion, it becomes difficult to stop. The world's reaction to the 2025 tariffs reveals a deeper truth about power in the global economy. Influence no longer rests solely on military strength or financial dominance. It rests on the ability to shape flows of goods, capital, and production. When those flows are disrupted, the consequences extend far beyond borders and balance sheets. As nations adapt, resist, and reposition themselves, one question remains unresolved. Is this moment a temporary shock that will eventually be absorbed, or the beginning of a more fractured global order where trade becomes a weapon rather than a bridge? The answer will determine not just who wins this trade war, but what kind of global economy emerges in its aftermath. Every major economic shock eventually forces the same uncomfortable question: who actually benefits and who pays the price? The tariff wave of 2025 has already made one thing clear. There will be no clean winners, only shifting advantages, delayed consequences, and trade-offs that unfold over years rather than months. What looks like a victory in one quarter can quietly turn into a liability in the next. At first glance, certain countries appear well positioned to gain. India stands near the top of that list, not because it suddenly replaced China, but because it fits into a world that is desperate for alternatives. With its massive labor force, expanding domestic market, and political push to attract foreign manufacturers, India has become a focal point for companies seeking to hedge against US-China tensions. Electronics assembly, pharmaceuticals, and automotive components are already seeing increased investment interest. For New Delhi, this moment aligns with long-standing ambitions to move up the global value chain rather than remain a provider of services and raw labor. Yet even here, the story is more complex than the headlines suggest. India's infrastructure constraints, regulatory friction, and uneven industrial ecosystems limit how fast it can absorb large-scale manufacturing shifts. The benefits will be real but gradual. They will accrue to specific regions, sectors, and firms, not evenly across the economy. And they will depend heavily on whether global demand remains strong enough to justify new capacity in the first place. Vietnam represents another apparent beneficiary. Its integration into global supply chains, proximity to China, and reputation for manufacturing efficiency have made it a preferred destination for China Plus One strategies. Apparel, electronics, and consumer goods production have expanded rapidly, but Vietnam's success carries its own risks. Rapid inflows strain labor markets, housing, and logistics. Wages rise, eroding the very cost advantages that attracted manufacturers in the first place. Over time, Vietnam may find itself confronting the same pressures that once pushed companies out of China. Mexico occupies a unique position in the shifting landscape. Proximity to the United States, existing trade frameworks, and an established industrial base make it a natural candidate for nearshoring. Automotive and electronics firms see Mexico as a way to reduce tariff exposure while staying close to the American consumer. In theory, this strengthens regional supply chains and reduces geopolitical risk. In practice, it also concentrates exposure. If trade policy remains volatile, dependence on a single market becomes its own vulnerability. Within the United States, domestic manufacturers are often presented as the clear winners. Tariffs raise the cost of foreign competitors, creating space for American producers to regain market share. In certain industries, this effect is real. Steel, aluminum, and selected advanced manufacturing sectors have seen improved pricing power. Investment announcements highlight new factories, expanded capacity, and reshoring initiatives that would have seemed unrealistic a decade ago. But here again, the deeper dynamics matter. Modern manufacturing is capital-intensive and highly automated. It does not recreate the employment patterns of the past. Even when production returns, it often generates fewer jobs than expected and requires skills that are in short supply. Meanwhile, higher input costs ripple through the economy, affecting downstream industries that rely on imported components. Gains in one sector can quietly impose losses on another. On the other side of the ledger, the list of losers is broader and more diffuse. China, despite its scale and resilience, faces undeniable pressure. Tariffs reduce access to the U.S. market, accelerate supply chain diversification, and reinforce the perception of China as a geopolitical risk rather than a purely economic partner. Over time, this threatens China's export-driven growth model and complicates its efforts to sustain employment and social stability. However, it would be a mistake to assume China simply absorbs the damage. Beijing has options. It can stimulate domestic demand, deepen trade ties with the global south, and invest aggressively in strategic industries. The real cost is not collapse but friction. Growth slows, efficiency declines, strategic mistrust hardens. The global economy becomes less optimized, and that inefficiency is a loss shared by everyone. Perhaps the most consistent losers are everyday consumers. Tariffs function as taxes, and taxes rarely disappear. Higher costs on electronics, vehicles, appliances, and pharmaceuticals work their way into retail prices. For middle and lower income households, these increases are not abstract. They affect purchasing decisions, living standards, and inflation expectations. Even when governments attempt to offset the impact through subsidies or monetary policy, the underlying pressure remains. For poorer countries already grappling with inflation, debt burdens, and fragile currencies, the consequences are especially severe. A slowdown in global trade reduces demand for exports. Higher import costs strain foreign exchange reserves. Food and energy prices become more volatile. These countries did not design the trade war, but they bear a disproportionate share of its fallout. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the interaction between trade policy and broader economic conditions. Tariffs introduced during periods of strong growth may be absorbed. Tariffs layered onto an already fragile global economy risk tipping it into recession. Inflation driven by supply constraints forces central banks into difficult choices, tightening policy even as growth slows. The margin for error narrows. This brings the debate back to its central unresolved question. Can tariffs by themselves restore American manufacturing dominance? History offers a mixed answer. Protection can buy time. It can encourage investment and reduce dependence on strategic rivals. But it cannot substitute for workforce development, infrastructure innovation, and stable policy. Without those foundations, protection risks becoming a permanent cost rather than a temporary tool. The deeper issue is not whether tariffs work, but what kind of system they create. A world defined by economic blocks, defensive trade policies, and constant retaliation is less efficient, less predictable, and more politically charged. Power shifts, but prosperity does not automatically follow. The winners gain leverage, not immunity. The losers absorb pain, not defeat. As the dust settles, the real outcome of the 2025 tariff shock will not be decided in a single election cycle or quarterly earnings report. It will emerge over years, shaped by how governments adapt, how companies restructure, and how societies absorb higher costs. The choices made now will determine whether this moment becomes a bridge to a more resilient economic order or the opening chapter of a prolonged period of fragmentation. That's the full picture behind the 2025 tariff shock and the global consequences now unfolding. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening beneath the headlines, make sure you support the channel by liking this video and subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. These economic shifts aren't slowing down, and each move is reshaping trade, inflation, and power across the world. Turn on notifications so you stay ahead as this story develops, because the long-term effects are only beginning to surface. In the next episode, we'll take a deeper look at how is trade war could permanently alter the global economy and what it means for the years ahead.